Like I said, my name is Simon Root. I'm a junior TR scholar here at Dickinson State. And it truly is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Edward Kohn. He's a native of Chicago. Received his bachelor's in history from a slightly not so well known Harvard University. And then his master's from Victoria University in Wellington. His PhD from McGill University in Montreal in Canada. And from there, since 2003, he's been at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, where he is the assistant professor of history and the chair of the Department of American Culture and Literature. So I think it's safe to say that Dr. Kohn has traveled enough for just about all of us. His interest in TR is well documented. He's studied his life and works very extensively and written several books, perhaps his most prominent being Hot Time in the Old Town, which is a look into TR's tenure as the police commissioner during the 10-day, 120-degree heat wave in New York City in 1896. He's come all this way to talk to us once again about the exploits of TR as a police commissioner. And I'm looking forward to absorbing all of that. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Edward Kohn.
Thank you, Simon. Well, thanks very much to Simon for that very nice introduction, and to the Theodore Roosevelt Center for the invitation as well. I always kind of make the joke that I'm coming from Turkey, I should get an award for being the person who traveled the farthest, but perhaps my reward is the fact that I'm here with all of you on a beautiful day, on a beautiful campus in Dickinson, North Dakota. And to talk about a great topic, the choice of Theodore Roosevelt and the law is an inspired choice, because I really think that Roosevelt and the law, Roosevelt equality before the law, equal enforcement of the law, law and order, and I think Roosevelt despised disorder. I mean, I think this goes to the heart of so much of Roosevelt's ideas and to his progressive ideas as well. And so when I first heard about the topic and I received the invitation, I thought back to about 10 years ago when I started researching Theodore Roosevelt. I was a much younger man back then, and I was the guest of Wallace Daly, the ever helpful and knowledgeable curator of the Theodore Roosevelt collection at Harvard. And I came across this little known Puck cartoon. And so my question to all of you looking at this cartoon is, what year, or about when do you think it's from, or what job do you think Roosevelt is doing to be depicted in this manner? And so just any guesses from the audience? Police commissioner, so about 1895, 1897, and that's what the Theodore Roosevelt collection had it labeled as. But there are some clues here. They're not that clear in this because it's expanded so much on the screen here. But this guy has H.O.T. on his hat, Hubert O. Thompson, the very corpulent and very corrupt Commissioner of Public Works, a Tammany wire puller who presided over a multi-million-dollar public works budget in New York City, in charge of the infrastructure as New York City is growing, and filled his pockets with taxpayers' money. So that's Hubert O. Thompson here. This is Davidson, Sheriff Davidson, the head of the Ludlow City Jail, the New York City Jail, which Davidson presided over as his personal fiefdom, raking in tons of money. He owned the horse and cart used to transport prisoners. And so whenever a prisoner was transported, he charged the money to the city and he pocketed it himself. They blackmailed prisoners. He put them in the worst dank, most unhealthy cell, and you say, well, you want to get out of here, you pay a little money. Absolutely, utterly corrupt. And then up here, you see John, who I think is supposed to be John Kelly, honest John Kelly, the Tammany boss from the 1880s. So what this actually depicts is a very young Theodore Roosevelt, and it has to do with the Roosevelt Committee, the investigating committee that Roosevelt chaired while he was in the New York Assembly, investigating corruption in New York City. And so I wanted to start with this, not because it's a trick question, got you, you were wrong, because the Theodore Roosevelt collection had it labeled like that as well. But to show that, a decade before he became police commissioner, somebody at Puck Magazine had the idea to already depict him in a policeman's uniform. And I think we could take this theme further and further and further. I'm a little embarrassed that I was so unimaginative that when, offered the chance to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and the law, I thought, police commissioner. It's so obvious. Why not foreign policy, right? The police power, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. When Roosevelt says, yes, every once in a while, some of these disorderly little Latin American and Caribbean countries need to be spanked by a civilized power, and in the Western Hemisphere, it's up to the United States to act as a police power. And that's actually the phrase Roosevelt used. And so he wasn't using that as a mistake. He chose those words very carefully. What I'm looking at today is Roosevelt as police commissioner, this great picture of Roosevelt. And remember, most of us are Theodore Roosevelt enthusiasts here. Most of us know what that means. He was one of 4 police commissioners. He was not police chief, but he was part of an oversight committee. This is part of Roosevelt's dedication to civil service reform and good government, an oversight committee making sure that police business was conducted without corruption, without politics, that hiring, firing, promotions, discipline was based on merit, or the lack thereof, and not based on who you knew, especially in Tammany Hall. And of course this reflects his lifelong interest in this. If there's one idea that Roosevelt adheres to from the beginning of his political career, right through till after his presidency, it's civil service reform and good government. He's just coming off being U.S. Civil Service Commissioner for 6 years by the time he heads back to what he refers to as my city, New York City, the city of his birth. When Roosevelt takes office in the spring of 1895, there's just been the famous Lexow Commission that has filed its report based on 10,000 pages of testimony detailing how absolutely corrupt New York's finest are, that they are essentially a unique criminal gang unto themselves on the streets of New York City. At one point, the Lexow Commission just says the only real answer is to fire all the policemen in New York City. And I did want to, I'm not sure if Doug Ellison is in the audience still, but I had to look it up because I couldn't remember, but on page 53 of this book, Roosevelt in April of 1881, he actually arrested a swindler in New York City. I mean, it's not too clear where the swindle took place or what kind of swindle, but here's another instance of Roosevelt, not in the West, deputy sheriff or no, a New York Knickerbocker coming face to face with a swindler, and he actually did some kind of citizen's arrest, or maybe uses arrest as a synonym for apprehend. But just to detail how bad things are in New York City among the police, so I just wanted to, the Lexow Committee report is a great and wonderful and horrible report. The way it characterizes what it's like to be under the thumb of the police department and their Tammany Hall allies in the 1890s in New York City. So for one thing, first of all, on election day, the police basically were Tammany Hall agents roughing up anybody who dared vote Republican in New York City. And the committee hears endless stories of police brutality, especially against, as are accounted, and I quote, the poor, ignorant foreigner residing on the great east side of the city. One story involved a Mrs. Urketel, and I'm quoting, a humble Russian Jewess, ignorant of our tongue, an honest and impoverished widow with 3 small children whom she was striving to support. A precinct detective had falsely accused this widow with 3 children of keeping a brothel in a back room of her store where her children slept. The detective demanded money, and when the woman could not pay, he secured false testimony from witnesses under his control and had her convicted. Her children were taken from her, and she had to sell her store to pay the resulting fine. When she was released from jail, she fell seriously ill. Quote, when she recovered, her home was gone, her children were gone, and she was penniless. The record of police corruption and abuse seemed endless. It has been abundantly proven, concluded the committee, that bootblacks, pushcart and fruit vendors, as well as keepers of soda water stands, corner grocerymen, sail makers, box makers, provision dealers, wholesale dry goods merchants and builders, steamboat and steamship companies who require police service on their docks, those who give public exhibitions, and in fact, all persons and all classes of persons whose business is subject to the observation of the police, or who may be reported as violating ordinances, or who may require the aid of police, all have to contribute in substantial sums to the vast amounts which flow into the station houses. Basically, everyone in New York City is somehow subject to and victim of police corruption. During the meeting of the Lexow Commission, witnesses were brought in still bloody from the beatings that they had gotten at the hands of policemen just right before. One guy, seemed like he had his eye hanging out of his socket, like resting on his chest. The police themselves, the committee concludes, had become a special criminal class in New York, quote, a separate and highly privileged class, armed with the authority and the machinery for oppression and punishment, but practically free themselves from the operation of the criminal law. So this is what is facing Theodore Roosevelt when he takes office in the spring of 1895. It is almost an impossible task. The police becoming the linchpin of corruption. And, there are revisionist historians who like to glamorize Tammany Hall, who like to excuse Tammany Hall. Oh, Tammany Hall. Yeah, there was corruption, but it was benign corruption. Tammany Hall did for immigrants what Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and their ilk wouldn't do. Tammany Hall welcomed the immigrants, helped give them a home, helped find them work, helped give them economic and political power that they usually would not have if left in the hands of Theodore Roosevelt and the New York Knickerbocker elite. Bull, or North Dakota, bison, right? A big load of bison. Absolutely not. Who were the greatest victims of police corruption, police brutality, police blackmail, bribery? It was these exact same ignorance. Ignorant of the law, ignorant of English, and powerless before a corrupt New York City police department. Roosevelt faced with a tremendous task. Arguably harder to reform New York City police than it was to reform the entire U.S. Civil Service Commission. So this is, some summary of some of these things that I detailed about, police being agents of Tammany Hall. Appointments and promotions were purchased. You want to be a police officer, you just pay your local Tammany boss, a few dollars, and hey, the next day you're a policeman on the streets of New York and you get to carry a gun or a big, billy club, which is basically, the size of a small baseball bat. Protection rackets are all down to, how big is the brothel, how many rooms are the brothel, where is it located, that's how much you have to pay to the police departments. And all this is just a river of money flowing into the New York City station houses. The special criminal class of New York City. The center of so much of this corruption. This is one of the things I like about Roosevelt in New York, is he had an almost holistic view of New York City. How do you make New York City, this exploding city because of immigration and urbanization, how do you make it a healthier, safer, more just place to live? And when he looked at the spider web of corruption, what was at the center of the web? Okay, the New York City police, but at the center of that specific corruption of this class of criminal, he saw the Sunday excise law, right? A blue law, something similar to what still exists in North Dakota, other parts of the United States. In North Dakota, if it's my understanding, you can't buy liquor before 11 a.m. on Sundays. I assume because you're all supposed to be in church instead of going to Walmart and buying, a six-pack. The law in New York City is no sale of liquor at all on the Sabbath. And this is not a law passed by New York City because New York City at the time didn't enjoy home rule. Right? Most of the laws pertaining to the city are actually written and passed in the state legislature in Albany. And so this law doesn't really reflect New York City opinion. It reflects a much more conservative, upstate, temperance opinion. And in New York City, it was just regularly violated with impunity. Especially unpopular among certain classes of immigrants, especially Germans with their beer gardens on Sundays, and Irish immigrants as well. The problem is, if the police want to close you down, they can. And they can say, well, we're just enforcing the law, but if you'd like to stay open, you can give us a few dollars. So many of the Tammany bosses were themselves saloon keepers, or local political bosses had their local headquarters in saloons. So you could see why closing down some saloons, leaving others open on Sunday, had political motivation as well. If you're a Tammany boss, obviously on Sunday you want your saloon open, but all the saloons in a 6 square block radius you'd like to see closed. So it is often a law that's ignored, but you can very lucratively, selectively enforce the law. This is exactly what was anathema to Theodore Roosevelt. This is the situation that Commissioner Roosevelt wanted to rectify, that the saloons were, the most profitable of the city's illegal ventures, with ties both to the police and to political corruption. Right? This is not a moral crusade by Theodore Roosevelt against the evil of drink. He is not a temperance advocate. When he was an undergraduate at Harvard, his diary entries are full of, I went on a bit of a spree last night. I went, drinking at the Porcelain, last night. I had to sleep in my friend's, dorm room, dressed in my tuxedo from the night before, and I almost ran into a proctor on the way home the next morning. Boy, that could have been embarrassing. This is a moral crusade for Roosevelt. I think for Roosevelt, most things are a moral crusade. Having breakfast is something probably of a moral crusade, but it's a moral crusade against not vice so much as a moral crusade against corruption, a moral crusade in favor of reform and good government, fair play, equality before the law. At the same time, Roosevelt is Roosevelt. He's old stock New York Knickerbocker, and he doesn't quite understand the role that saloons play in the lives of working class immigrant laborers. Saloons often did give away lots of free things, not just a free lunch, but free newspapers, free check cashing services. They often acted as kind of the local job bureau. So if you're an Italian construction worker and you're wondering, gee, next week, where's my next job going to come from? Yeah, you go to a saloon on Sunday, and it's kind of a clearinghouse for local jobs. Also, this is a time when people work 6 days a week. Right? If you don't get to go to your favorite saloon on a Sunday, when can you go? And there have been lots written about, and I didn't know this, I'm not a social historian, I didn't know this until I read a book on it, about saloons being this very important alternative space for, working class laborers. You're out from under the thumb of your employer, out from under the thumb perhaps of the Catholic Church. So here's a place that you go for community and to feel empowered as well. So saloons weren't just a place, like I said, to get a drink, right? They're actually a very important alternative communal space for New York working class immigrants in Roosevelt's day. When Roosevelt took office in early 1895, there were between 12 and 15,000 saloons operating in New York City. Within a few months, Roosevelt had been successful in closing almost all of them on Sundays, about 97% of them, stopping the flow of lots of beer. And a result of this, Roosevelt had become perhaps the most unpopular man in New York City. He was criticized, of course, by Democrats. He was criticized by German Americans who usually voted Republican, and he was criticized by his fellow Republicans themselves, who, when the Republicans in the city went down in disastrous elections, city elections for the Assembly in 1895, city Republicans blamed Theodore Roosevelt. They didn't even let him campaign or give speeches for other Republican candidates because Roosevelt had become so unpopular. And in an infamous or notorious incident, somebody even mailed Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt a letter bomb, and a postal clerk opened it to find it loaded only with sawdust, thank goodness, but it kind of indicates, a symbol of how unpopular Commissioner Roosevelt's Saloon-Closing Crusade was. When a U.S. Senator from New York, Democrat David Hill, attacked Roosevelt for wasting police resources on this crusade rather than fighting crime, Roosevelt chose to give a speech to a German-American audience, right? He went to kind of the home of his enemies to answer this. And what Roosevelt said was, look, this law was never meant to be honestly enforced. And I quote Roosevelt, "It was meant to be used to blackmail and browbeat the saloon keepers who were not the slaves of Tammany Hall, while the big Tammany Hall bosses who owned saloons were allowed to violate the law with impunity and to corrupt the police force at will. With such a law as this enforced only against the poor or the honest man, and violated with impunity by every rich scoundrel and every corrupt politician, the machine did indeed seem to have its yoke on the neck of the people. But we threw off that yoke." Always aware of the power of the press and public opinion, Roosevelt had made a great effort to explain his actions and motivation. At the beginning of the Sunday Excise Crusade, the New York Sun had questioned why Roosevelt would act against public sentiment. And Roosevelt famously replied, "I do not deal with public sentiment, I deal with the law." All right, this could be the motto of the symposium. Roosevelt also pointed out that lax enforcement resulted in a system in which saloon keepers bribed policemen or hid behind political influence. And for Roosevelt, the problem was with having a law, and I quote, "which is not strictly enforced," so this is Roosevelt, "which certain people are allowed to violate with impunity for corrupt reasons, while other offenders who lack their political influence are mercilessly harassed." All our resources will be strained to prevent any such discrimination and to secure the equal punishment of all offenders. Right? Equal enforcement of the law, equality before the law, equal treatment of all citizens by the government, hallmarks of Roosevelt's thought. In 1896, there was a new challenge to the anti-saloon, the Sunday Saloon-Closing Crusade, in the form of the Raines Law. John Raines, another one of these upstate New York senators, again, this is meant to be an anti-liquor, temperance law, and it basically said two things in this law. The first thing, you are forbidden now, if you run a saloon, from giving out a free lunch. All right, free lunches had been given out as a way to lure in midday drinkers who are usually the working poor, right? People who don't have jobs. So this is Raines's way of trying to cut out that lure for working class, especially immigrants in New York City. But another bit of a loophole was made in the Raines Law. It allowed Sunday liquor selling in hotels. Anything with a bunch of rooms to let basically counted as a hotel. So if you are on the ground floor of a tenement running your saloon, what do? You just start renting out a lot of the rooms above your saloon, and you say, hey, I'm a hotel. Fantastic. Gee, what are people doing in those rooms? And so there is a rise in gambling, a rise in prostitution, a rise in unmarried couples using these rooms. So suddenly you're replacing one vice with a slew of other vices. No more free lunches, hence there's no such thing as a free lunch. By the summer of 1896, such new Raines Law's hotels were springing up daily. The development was widely seen as seedy and unwelcome. Renting out rooms in taverns struck many as a throwback to the days when prostitutes plied their trade on stairways, just a few feet from the saloon floor. And this is, daring robbery in daylight. A guy by the name of Hurdling knocked down in a Raines hotel. Watch, money, clothing taken. Right? These Raines Law hotels, that's what they call them that. They're not real hotels. Right? They're fly-by-night operations which are breeding grounds of crime. In August 6th editorial, the New York Times complained that in one precinct where there had been only 2 real hotels before passage of the Raines Law, only 2, there now existed 51 hotels that sold liquor on Sundays. And I quote, "in all hours of the night, with impunity and with a noticeable increase of drunkenness and disorder." The paper complained about the Raines Law humbug. This is a huge blow to Roosevelt. Roosevelt, with the best of intentions, had enforced an incredibly unpopular law. He'd been attacked by both Republicans and Democrats, by German Americans, by the press. In a recent development, by the summer of 1896, tailors on the Lower East Side have walked out on strike, and there are lots of violent confrontations between the tailors and contractors, their former employers, about the contractors' use of scab employees. And a lot of newspapers are blaming this on Roosevelt. Hey, where are the police? They're all being used on Sundays to close the saloons instead of trying to keep the peace on the Lower East Side, where tens of thousands of tailors have walked out on strike. And for what? Right? This crusade was largely a failure. And all of this is bad news for Roosevelt. And it pretty much meant the end of any future political career using New York City as a base, which is sad. Because, of course, this is what I've looked at with Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York. He was raised in New York. He always referred to New York as my city. He had represented New York in the New York State Assembly. He had run unsuccessfully for mayor of New York. Yet, In this defeat were sown the seeds of future political victory. After that disastrous 1895 Republican defeat in the city that Republican Party leaders blamed on Roosevelt, Roosevelt was worried. And as he so often did, he wrote to his friend and political mentor, Henry Cabot Lodge, that party leaders they're distancing themselves from me. They're not letting me campaign. They're not letting me give speeches. This is the end. This is the end of Theodore Roosevelt and New York City. Lodge, older than Roosevelt, often I think more politically savvy than Roosevelt, more politically experienced than Roosevelt, certainly at this time. Lodge has gone from Congress to the Senate. What is Roosevelt in 1895, 1896? He's holding a rather unimportant, unelected office in New York City. It's Lodge who says, wait a second, there's a bigger story here. You have to broaden your vision a little bit. So this is what Lodge says. You are making a great place and reputation for yourself, which will lead surely to even better things. Remember, too, that apart from the great principle of enforcing all laws, there's a very large and powerful body of Republicans in the state, not the New York City, the state at large, who will stand by you and behind you because you're enforcing that particular law. This may be a narrow view, Lodge says, but it is of the greatest political importance. In other words, yes, your career in New York City is done. When Roosevelt runs for governor, vice president, president, New York City is not going to come out in droves for candidate Theodore Roosevelt. Outside of New York City, upstate New York, more conservative New York that had implemented this law in the first place, Lodge is saying they're paying attention. So yeah, your next seat, political position, isn't going to be a seat in Congress from New York City. Maybe it's going to be a statewide office. Maybe you'll even have this chair sitting next to me in the U.S. Senate. And of course, Lodge isn't that far off, right? Within a couple years, Roosevelt isn't elected to the U.S. Senate, but he is elected to another statewide position, governor of New York State. So too, the anti-Saloon Crusade can tell us much about Roosevelt's progressive ideas about fair play, equal enforcement of the law, as I mentioned earlier. Later, in 1903, after becoming president, at a speech at the New York State Fair, Roosevelt summed up this view in what would become known as the square deal. I'll do a lengthy excerpt, not that lengthy. So this is Theodore Roosevelt. There must be ever present in our minds the fundamental truth that in a republic such as ours, the only safety is to stand neither for nor against any man because he is rich or because he is poor, because he is engaged in one occupation or another, because he works with his brains or because he works with his hands. You must treat each man on his worth and merits as a man. You must see that each is given a square deal because he is entitled to no more and should receive no less. Finally, we must keep ever in mind that a republic such as ours can exist only by virtue of the orderly liberty which comes through equal domination of the law over all men alike. Right? I love that phrase, orderly liberty which comes through equal domination of the law over all men alike, and through its administration in such resolute and fearless fashion as shall teach all that no man is above it all and no man below it. Right? Orderly liberty which comes through equal domination of the law. It might have been Roosevelt's motto for his time on the police commission and his crusade against Sunday liquor selling. It's an idea that would guide his presidency, leading to one of the greatest eras of reform in American history, the progressive era. And so much of it comes out of Roosevelt being an urban progressive. How do you make America's largest city safer, healthier? And this is during a time of urbanization. When Roosevelt is born, only about 1 in 5 Americans live in cities. In Roosevelt's very first presidential message to Congress in 1901, Roosevelt says, look, now 40% of Americans live in cities. Right? Urbanization is taking place at a greater rate than the population growth of the United States. City problems are now America's problems. And so as President Roosevelt would be in a position to apply such ideas to the nation at large and even to the world. And these are some of the ideas that I explore. So this is, Roosevelt, again, being depicted as a policeman wielding the big stick. Right? These are very fundamental ideas for all of Roosevelt's career, political career, West, East, New York City, Washington, D.C., and as President of the United States. And these are some of the ideas that I explore in my books, and I thank you very much.
You'll take a few questions?
Absolutely.
First of all, I need to explain to you the blue laws of North Dakota. You can't buy alcohol in a grocery store, ever.
Okay.
Or at Walmart.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
So when I was growing up, we had very severe blue laws, but they're lightening a little bit. But I lived in Nevada for a time. You could buy alcohol in a funeral home in Nevada 24 hours a day. But here we still have the remnants of some blue laws that were pretty strong.
Yeah.
So back to New York. So you said at the end of your talk that his political career in the city was over because of this. Have you looked at the election results for the 1898 gubernatorial election for the city itself? How did he do there?
Oh, he did terribly. I mean, famously, Roosevelt won the governor's race by a plurality of, 18,000 votes? I mean, that's not much. Roosevelt, on the one hand, he explicitly blamed reformers like himself, right? People like the mugwumps, like Godkin at the Evening Post, who were always very critical of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt hated the mugwumps, people who would vote Democrat at the drop of a hat, people who, wrote lots of articles and had lots of, righteous indignation meetings at Cooper Union, but they didn't do anything. And they didn't enter politics like Theodore Roosevelt did. So on the one hand, he blamed a lot of fellow reformers, but on the other hand, New York City is a Democratic city. I think McKinley was in 1896 was the first Republican president to win New York City since the Civil War. The city was a Democratic city. So it's not a big surprise that, not just that he was unpopular after 1895 and 1896, not a big surprise that he wasn't getting a big vote from the city.
He might not have.
He might not have
right.
Anyway. That's
but he
right.
certainly didn't make things.
This did not help. Yeah.
Questions for our presenter here. Tired after lunch.
It's after lunch, I know.
Let me ask you the question. The parade. So Roosevelt is not afraid to go face his detractors, and the German-American League has a parade and invites him to come thinking he won't show up.
That's right. And I love this about Roosevelt, that, he doesn't just go to I think about some of the town hall meetings and rallies during our wonderful primary season that we're having in this country. Now you go to places that have been filled and stocked with your most rabid supporters because you want people to be cheering and clapping. And what does Roosevelt do? He goes to the one group, perhaps, in New York City to explain very clearly, very logically, very dispassionately, what am I doing? I'm enforcing the law that is tending to make this entire city, including for you German Americans, a unsafe, unjust place to live. I don't see too many politicians or future presidents doing that today or even in the past 100 years.
He goes right to the heart of the opposition.
Absolutely.
Gives his speech, no holds barred, no apology, no attempts to shade what he has to say.
And of course, why do we have, this has been a theme of the symposium, and I'm sure a previous symposia, why do we have these records of things that Roosevelt said? Because reporters did follow Roosevelt around. So Roosevelt is also savvy in that way. He knows that when he's talking to the German Americans, he's not just talking to, a few thousand people who, are going to the beer garden on Sundays. He's talking to the Evening Post and the New York Times and the New York Sun as well.
Well, didn't he go, he was invited to this parade, and so they didn't think he would show up, and he's up on the viewing stand looking at this set of paraders, and they're very upset with him, and someone shouts up from the crowd, "Wo ist der Roosevelt?" And then he says, "Ich bin here!" He waves, he's not afraid at all, he's right there.
And I mean, even more of a backstory, and I don't mean to digress too much, but, Roosevelt loved Germany, right? He had spent a summer in Dresden with his brother learning German, living with a German family. He loved the German language, he loved German poetry. If you think way ahead to the First World War, this is probably one of the most heartbreaking things for Roosevelt, because he loved all things German. And German immigrants were not the same as Irish Catholic immigrants, right? German, not all Protestant, but mostly Protestant, excellent reputation for honesty, cleanliness. Roosevelt, and where Roosevelt was born in Gramercy Park, very close to, Ein kleines Deutschland, little Germany. So Roosevelt loves the Germans. I mean, he could have given the speech in German. I mean, no problem. You could look at the German classes he took at Harvard, and he was getting like 100%, because he was fluent in German. Loved German poetry. So to lose I think the German support in particular, this was another, the slings of arrows for poor Roosevelt.
Questions? Yes, here.
How long did the Tammany Hall exist? Because
Tammany Hall.
I just read a book where Eleanor Roosevelt, one of her sons, was denied a job in New York City because of this, and she ended up getting the guy, of course.
Yeah.
How long was the grip of Tammany?
The grip is one thing. I mean, Tammany Hall still exists. It was basically founded by Aaron Burr. So you're talking about 200 years. And so, I mean, this is, Roosevelt and urban reform, going back to his time in the New York State Assembly. I mean, this is exactly what Roosevelt's trying to do, is to kind of break this death grip that Tammany, the Tweed political corruption, the courthouse, well into the 20th century. Al Smith, when he runs for president in 1928 against Hoover, how did Al Smith rise in the ranks in New York City? He was affiliated with Tammany Hall. Very hard to get elected president of the United States when you're tarnished with that same brush as Tammany Hall. So, I mean, Tammany Hall's real strong influence on democratic politics, which for the most part is New York City politics, well after the Second World War. I mean, long time.
Back here.
What happened to New York after Roosevelt left the job? Was it business as usual then, or?
Once he leaves the job, what happens?
Yeah, it's business as usual. I mean, and this is, the fantastic book Island of Vice. This is the conclusion there as well. We all like Roosevelt. We all admire him. I admire what he tried to do, but New York it's Gotham. It's the Empire City. 2 years of simply being a one man on a police commission, which is deadlocked between 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. This isn't enough time to make a huge difference. He makes a difference, but not an enormous difference. And unfortunately, probably kills any future possibility of perhaps running for Congress in New York City, or running for mayor again, which he had turned down. He becomes police commissioner in May of 1895. In 1894, he had turned down a chance to run again for mayor of New York City. His wife Edith said, "We can't afford it." Right? Political candidates are expected to put in their own money, and Edith, who was taking care of the money, Roosevelt didn't have much of a mind for money, she said no, and Roosevelt immediately regretted it, because who becomes mayor? Mayor Strong, who is a mayor, much like a reform Republican mayor, much in Roosevelt's mold.
That had an effect on the rest of their lives as a couple, because she quashed his plan to run for mayor. He regretted it. She regretted it. She said, "I shouldn't have done that, and I will never stop Theodore again from doing something that his mind is set on." And of course, his mind was set on many, many adventures.
Yeah, but there's never been a New York City mayor elected president of the United States. Maybe, a blessing in disguise that Roosevelt was not elected mayor.
Other questions? Yes, here.
Yeah.
So paraphrase that and pick it up. So L'Omerta, the coming of the
Right.
mafia to fill that gap and protection rackets, and then the Gideon and Veranda decisions as they come out of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, not being a social historian, I don't know that much about the Italian community in New York City. So I don't know when and how that mechanism took place that, yeah, you might be successful in cleaning up New York City police control over corruption, but somebody else is going to march into that breach, perhaps based on, ethnicity, Italians, Irish, Germans, whoever. So I confess my ignorance about that. In terms of, Roosevelt and the future decisions about Miranda and so on, I don't know. I wonder if this is taking our kind of postmodern ideas about justice and whether or not Roosevelt would have even had that on his radar at all. The idea that every single person who gets marched into a precinct house in New York City has to be supplied with a government-paid lawyer. Where are these guys coming from? So I'm not sure if Theodore Roosevelt, despite his belief in the law, despite his belief in democracy, despite his belief that government is responsible for the individual citizen, I'm not sure he would have advanced that far. Although, obviously, Roosevelt, father of the New Deal, grandfather of the New Deal, great-grandfather of the Great Society, the first president who ever said it is the federal government's job to be responsible for each and every individual citizen. I think that is one of Roosevelt's greatest legacies.
Yeah, well said. Last chance for this moment. Yes, here.
I'm just wondering, you were talking about an effort that failed. Were there other efforts in his time, those 2 years, that actually succeeded in some kind of reform?
Yeah.
Well,
His broader reforms did not succeed.
Absolutely. Roosevelt, I think it's without dispute that Roosevelt, in terms of, equipping policemen with firearms, helping them to, train in firearms, and, one of my favorite instances is during the heat wave of 1896, where Theodore Roosevelt, all on his own, mobilized the police to be like an extra ambulance corps because there weren't enough ambulances and New Yorkers were dropping like flies, and also came up with a scheme to give away free ice down in the tenement communities at a time where you had an ice box, and ice is a life-saving commodity, and there was actually an ice trust, a trust of ice in New York City. So what did Roosevelt do? He gave away free ice. He busted the ice trust, and he also, this future president of the United States, walked through the tenement districts to see how people were using the free ice. And so he saw, mothers wrapping up a piece of ice in a handkerchief and putting it around their infants' foreheads. He saw fathers, immigrant labor fathers, chipping off pieces of ice and giving it to their children. And I have to think, how many American presidents before or since, perhaps besides like Barack Obama, have had such intimate contact with America's urban poor and working poor. So there are good stories and success stories from his 2 years as police commissioner. So thanks for that question.
Ted, we're out of time, and I want you to go sign some books at the lobby while we take our break. But we're talking today, I think one of the sub-themes of this symposium is breaking myths about Roosevelt. And by the way, I would be pretty careful on that swindler arrest, because maybe Doug is going to show that didn't happen either. But the question is about the mythology of Roosevelt out at night in disguise, Haroon R. Roosevelt. How big a deal was that, where he would go out in semi-incognito dress to try to observe the cops?
Yeah, I think this, on the one hand, this was Roosevelt, going out with Jacob Riis, who, we know now from The Other Half Lives, but who had been a police reporter. And here comes Roosevelt, who's never afraid to say, I don't know something, right? Roosevelt, the scientist, Roosevelt, the historian. I don't know what's going on. Jacob Riis, show me what's going on. So I think in terms of, and instead of just going into, the police commission and sitting in his office and, signing pieces of paper or going to meetings. I think it's a very typical Roosevelt saying, I don't know what this position entails, but I know somebody who does know. Take me by the hand and take me through the back alleys and the tenement districts to see, the policemen who are asleep at the job or who are in brothels instead. So I think it's very important. Again, only 2 years as police commissioner to get that very kind of rapid education in what was needed for the police department.
And this goes to Roosevelt's capacity to learn from books that he read. So he reads How the Other Half Lives, which pioneered the use of flashbulb photography in order to photograph these tenements. He appears at Reese's office, leaves a card and says, I'm here to help.
Yeah, that's
amazing
right.
that book changed his life.
Yeah, it's very good. And also, I like also the idea of Roosevelt, who, when he goes into a job, or he goes out west, or he's a rancher or hunter, he kind of approaches everything with his whole being. It's not just a physical experience. It's an intellectual experience. It's a spiritual experience. It's experience as a historian, as a scientist. And this is something that's going to be in a new book by the Harvard professor Michael Canfield called Theodore Roosevelt in the Field. I think it's coming out in November. And so, he kind of looks at Roosevelt's experiences, including in the West, including the Maine woods, Adirondacks, and looks at how Roosevelt isn't just trying to build up his body or be macho, but as such a multifaceted person, he always approaches all of these different endeavors with his entire being. It's a very interesting look at Theodore Roosevelt.
Thank you, Professor Edward Kohn.
Thank you, Clay.
Come on up, Sharon.